My father-in-law made me train my replacement, but he didn't know I owned the family business. The first time Richard Hensley lied to my face was at my wedding reception. "Welcome to the family," he'd said, champagne flute raised toward me, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Not every family business gets blessed with talent from the outside. From the outside. As if I were some foreign object that had attached itself to the Hensley dynasty. I should have seen it for what it was, not a welcome, but a warning. A reminder of my place in the hierarchy he'd constructed. But I was too busy smiling, too focused on my new husband James's hand in mine, too hopeful about the future stretching before us. That was 7 years ago. Now, I sat across from Richard in his sprawling corner office at Hensley Textiles headquarters, watching him pretend to study my quarterly report while actually studying me. At 48, Richard still had the sharp, predatory features that stared out from the company's About Us page. Salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed, suit tailored to hide the slight paunch of middle age, gold cufflinks bearing the Hensley crest, a roaring lion clutching a bolt of fabric. "These numbers are good, Olivia," he finally said, closing the folder. "Very good, actually." I kept my face neutral despite the warmth that bloomed in my chest. After years of grinding 70-hour weeks, expanding our market share by 22%, and dragging their production processes into the 21st century, very good was the closest thing to praise I'd ever received. "Thank you, Richard. The Southeast Asian expansion is proving even more successful than our projections." He nodded absently, his attention already drifting to the framed photos on his desk. Most featured Carter, his son and my brother-in-law, receiving awards, shaking hands and standing proudly next to his father. Not a single photo of James, his younger son, and my husband. "Family is everything to me, Olivia," Richard said suddenly, the non sequitur hanging awkwardly between us. "The Hensley name goes back 4 generations in textiles. Did you know that?" I nodded, though he didn't need my confirmation. Everyone who worked at Hensley Textiles had heard the mythologized founding story, how Richard's grandfather had started with a single loom in his basement during the Depression, how his father had expanded it into the powerhouse it was today, and how Richard himself had modernized and globalized the brand. The story was engraved on a bronze plaque in a lobby, printed in every company brochure, repeated at every corporate retreat. It was gospel. "Carter understands the weight of that legacy," Richard continued. "He was born to lead this company." Unlike James, went the unspoken comparison. My husband had chosen architecture over textiles, a decision that Richard had never forgiven nor understood. Speaking of leadership, Richard pivoted, his tone shifting to something almost conspiratorial. "I'd like you to take on a special project." I straightened in my chair. After 7 years of proving myself, was this finally it? The vice presidency I'd been working toward? The seat at the table I'd earned through sweat and sacrifice? Carter's fiancée, Eliza, has expressed interest in joining the executive team, Richard continued, shattering my momentary hope. Bright girl. Harvard MBA. Comes from the Wellington family. Major players in retail distribution. Of course she did. Carter had always excelled at making strategic alliances. His engagement to Eliza Wellington had made the business pages before it made the society columns. "I'd like you to show her the ropes. Train her in operations, introduce her to our key accounts, bring her up to speed on our overseas ventures." Richard's smile was wide but empty. "You've done remarkable work here, and no one is better positioned to onboard our future leadership." Future leadership. The words landed like ice in my stomach. "And what will my role be once Eliza is up to speed?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "We'll figure that out when the time comes. You've been putting in long hours for years now. Perhaps you'd like to scale back, focus more on family? James mentioned you two might start thinking about children soon." He hadn't. We hadn't discussed children at all. But it was just like Richard to invent whatever narrative suited his purposes. "I see," was all I could manage. "Wonderful." Richard stood, signaling the end of our meeting. "Eliza starts Monday. I know you'll make this transition smooth for everyone." As I walked back to my office on shaky legs, The truth crystallized with brutal clarity. I wasn't being asked to mentor a promising new hire. I was being asked to train my replacement, to document my own expertise, hand over my client relationships, and show Eliza exactly how to step into the role I had spent years mastering. And then I was expected to quietly fade away. Because no matter how much value I brought to the company, no matter how many markets I opened or profits I generated, I would always be from the outside. Just someone who had married in not blood, not real family. I sat at my desk and stared out the window at the city below, the familiar burn of injustice rising in my throat. 7 years of loyalty, of canceled vacations and missed dinners, of putting the company first. And this was my reward. A polite dismissal packaged as an honor. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I had been lied to quite enough in my life. And I didn't take kindly to being discarded. Fine. I would train Eliza. I would smile and share, and pretend I didn't see the writing on the wall. But Richard Hensley was about to learn a painful lesson about underestimating the woman he saw as nothing more than an outsider who had married into his precious family. Because what he didn't know was that my own bloodline ran deeper into the foundations of Hensley Textiles than he could possibly imagine. 3 days after Richard's bombshell, I found myself in my grandmother Eleanor's attic, rain drumming against the roof like impatient fingers on a desk. Grandma Eleanor had passed away just a month earlier at 92, and I'd been putting off the painful task of sorting through her belongings. "You okay up there?" James called from below. "Fine," I answered, though I was anything but. The conversation with Richard still burned in my mind, the humiliation fresh as an open wound. I hadn't told James yet. How could I explain to my husband that his father was pushing me out of the company I'd helped build? James already carried enough guilt about his strained relationship with Richard. This would only make things worse. The attic was like a time capsule. Old furniture draped in sheets, trunks filled with clothes from bygone eras, photo albums documenting generations of the Langford family. My family. I'd always been closer to my maternal grandparents than my parents, who had died in a car accident when I was 19. Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa William had raised me after that. I ran my fingers over a dusty trunk, remembering how Grandpa William used to tell me stories about his business ventures. He'd been successful, though he'd never specified exactly what he'd done. Just some old manufacturing contracts, he'd say with a wink. Nothing interesting. At the back of the attic, behind a stack of old suitcases, I spotted a metal lockbox I'd never seen before. It was secured with a combination lock, gathering dust as if it had been untouched for decades. I dragged it into the light. On top was an envelope addressed simply, "For Olivia, open upon my passing. William Langford." A chill ran down my spine. Grandpa had been gone for 12 years. Had this been waiting for me all this time? With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a brief letter and a slip of paper with a 3-digit combination. "My dearest Olivia, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. There are truths I kept from you, not out of deception but protection. The contents of this box tell a story I couldn't bring myself to share while alive. It's a story of partnership, betrayal, and a legacy that rightfully belongs to you. I leave this in your hands to use as you see fit. You always had the best judgment of anyone I know. All my love, Grandpa William." My hands shook as I dialed the combination. Eleanor's birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside, the box was filled with documents, yellowed with age, but preserved in plastic sheeting. On top was a black and white photograph I'd never seen before. 2 young men stood proudly in front of a brick building with a hand-painted sign, "Langford and Hensley Textile Works, EST 1946. I nearly dropped the photo. Langford and Hensley. Langford first. My grandfather and Richard's father. Heart racing, I began sorting through the documents. Partnership agreements. Patent applications. Trademark registrations. Production formulas for specialized textile treatments that I recognized as the cornerstone of Hensley Textiles' most profitable product lines. All of them bearing my grandfather's signature. William Langford, co-founder and majority owner. One document caught my eye, a thick legal agreement dated 1965. I skimmed it, then read it again more carefully, my breathing growing shallow. The document outlined how my grandfather had stepped away from the daily operations of the company, allowing Harold Hensley, Richard's father, to take over management. But contrary to whatever story Richard had been told, William hadn't surrendered ownership of the company's intellectual property. The agreement explicitly maintained his ownership of all patents, trademarks, and proprietary formulas, the very assets that gave Hensley Textiles its competitive edge. And near the bottom, in language that made my legal training tingle with recognition, was a clause stating that upon William Langford's death, all rights would transfer to his heirs. To me, I sat back against an old trunk, mind reeling. For 12 years, I had unknowingly been the legal owner of Hensley Textiles' most valuable assets. The company couldn't legally use its own name, produce its signature fabrics, or manufacture its most profitable product lines without my permission. The final document in the box was a letter from my grandfather's attorney, dated just after his death, explaining that all rights had been transferred into my name as per William's final wishes. The attorney had apparently tried to contact me several times, but I'd been in the midst of law school finals, then my parents' deaths, and somehow the messages had never reached me. Olivia? James appeared at the top of the attic stairs. You've been up here for hours. He found me sitting amidst the scattered documents, tears streaming down my face, tears of shock, vindication, and a strange sense of betrayal. Why hadn't Grandpa told me any of this while he was alive? What's all this? James asked, crouching beside me. I handed him the photograph. Your grandfather and my grandfather, I said softly. Business partners. Co-founders of what became Hensley Textiles. James stared at the photo, confusion etched across his features. That's impossible. Dad always said his father started the company alone. Well, your dad is either lying or was lied to himself, I replied, passing him the partnership agreement. Because according to these documents, not only did my grandfather help found the company, he retained ownership of all the intellectual property. The patents, the trademarks, the formulas. James scanned the documents, his face growing paler with each page. This can't be right. Dad would know about this. Would he? I asked. Or would your grandfather have kept it from him, just like my grandfather kept it from me? We spent the next 3 hours going through every document, verifying each signature, tracing the legal thread that connected my grandfather's legacy to my present. There was no doubt. I owned the intellectual soul of Hensley Textiles. As the rain continued to fall outside, a plan began to form in my mind. Richard wanted me to train Eliza? Fine. I would show her everything about the company, almost everything. But while I played the dutiful employee, I would be quietly preparing to reclaim what was rightfully mine. What are you thinking? James asked, watching my expression change. I carefully placed the documents back in the lockbox. I'm thinking it's time for a history lesson at Hensley Textiles. Just not quite yet. For the first time since my meeting with Richard, I smiled. The man who saw me as an outsider was about to discover just how deeply my roots ran in his precious family empire. Monday morning arrived with a subtle dread of an approaching storm. I'd spend the weekend consulting discreetly with a patent attorney friend who confirmed what I already suspected. The documents were legitimate. I owned the intellectual property that Hensley Textiles couldn't function without. I arrived at the office early, arranging my desk with military precision, company reports stacked neatly, sales projections displayed on my second monitor, a fresh legal pad ready for notes. The stage was set for Eliza Wellington's grand entrance. At precisely 9:05 a.m., the unmistakable click of designer heels announced her arrival. I looked up to see a woman who could have stepped from the pages of a business fashion magazine. Sleek blonde bob, expertly tailored navy suit, leather portfolio clutched in manicured hands. Every inch the corporate princess Richard had described. You must be Olivia, she said, her smile practiced but cold. Richard has told me so much about you. I doubted that very much. Welcome to Hensley Textiles, Eliza, I replied, rising to shake her hand. Her grip was firmer than I expected. I've been looking forward to learning from you. Something flickered across her face. A flash of calculation, perhaps? Richard says you've been instrumental in expanding the company's international presence. I gestured to the chair opposite my desk. 7 years of work condensed into a compliment. That's Richard for you. She laughed, a genuine sound that surprised me. He does have a gift for understatement when it comes to others' achievements. Was this a potential ally? I filed the observation away as I pulled up our operations dashboard. Let's start with an overview of our production facilities. I began clicking through to the manufacturing metrics. We have domestic factories in North Carolina and Georgia, with international production in Vietnam, Bangladesh, and recently, Indonesia. Eliza leaned forward, her eyes sharply assessing the numbers on the screen. These efficiency ratings are impressive. Was this implementation you're doing? I nodded, explaining the lean manufacturing principles I'd introduced 3 years ago. As we delved into the details, I found myself reluctantly impressed. Eliza was smart, Harvard MBA smart. She asked insightful questions and grasped complex concepts quickly. Just before lunch, Richard appeared in my doorway, beaming like a proud father. "How's the training going, ladies?" "Smoothly," Eliza answered before I could speak. "Olivia's been incredibly thorough." "Excellent." Richard clapped his hands together. "Eliza, why don't you join me for lunch? The country club makes an excellent salmon on Mondays." I wasn't invited, of course. As they walked away, I heard Richard's low voice. "You'll have your own office by the end of the month. Corner suite on the executive floor." My office. The one I'd earned through years of dedication. After they left, I closed my door and pulled out my phone. "Sarah? It's Olivia. Is that offer to join your firm still open?" Sarah had been trying to recruit me to her consulting practice for years. "No, I'm not accepting yet, but I might need a backup plan very soon." The afternoon continued with a deep dive into our supplier relationships. I showed Eliza everything in our official documentation, but not the personal relationships I'd cultivated, the unwritten agreements, the cultural nuances I'd learned through years of trial and error. The Nguyen family in Vietnam prefers video calls to emails, I explained, passing her a supplier list. Mr. Patel in Bangladesh needs at least 3 days to consider any contract changes. It's a respect thing. Eliza dutifully noted these details, but I could tell she didn't grasp their importance. These weren't facts to memorize. They were relationships built on trust and understanding, relationships that couldn't be transferred through a training session. By 5 o'clock, Eliza's energy remained undimmed while I fought exhaustion. Not from the training itself, but from the constant performance, pretending I didn't know what was happening, pretending I was willingly surrendering everything I'd built. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, gathering her things. "I'd love to dig into the Southeast Asian expansion. Those growth numbers are phenomenal." "Actually," I countered, "tomorrow I thought we'd review the company's intellectual property portfolio. Patents, trademarks, proprietary processes, the assets that give us our competitive edge." Interest sparked in her eyes. "Perfect. Richard mentioned those are crucial to the company's valuation." I bet he did. After she left, I stayed late, alone in my office as darkness settled over the city. I opened my personal laptop and pulled up the documents from my grandfather's lockbox, comparing them with the company's official records. The discrepancies were striking. According to Hensley's corporate archives, Harold Hensley was sole founder and inventor of the company's proprietary textile treatments. A complete fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dinner? I picked up the Thai food you like." "Be home soon," I replied. "Love you." I printed several key documents from my grandfather's collection and slipped them into my briefcase. Tomorrow, I would begin carefully revealing the truth to Eliza. Not everything, just enough to gauge her reaction. Would she run straight to Richard? Or might she have more integrity than I was giving her credit for? As I walked to the elevator, I passed Richard's office. He was still there on the phone laughing about something. Through the glass wall, I caught fragments, transition period and fresh blood and by summer's end. My replacement timeline being discussed as if I were already gone. I stepped into the elevator, my resolve hardening with each floor that passed. For years, I'd been underestimated, dismissed as an outsider who had married into the family. I'd worked twice as hard to prove my worth, only to be cast aside when someone with the right pedigree came along. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. I wasn't just training my replacement. I was preparing for a reckoning that would reshape the entire Hensley empire. And it would begin with tomorrow's little history lesson about intellectual property rights. 3 weeks of training Eliza had felt like an eternity. Each morning, I walked through Hensley Textiles' glass doors, knowing I was actively participating in my own professional execution. But unlike the condemned, I had an ace up my sleeve, one I was finally ready to play. Over those weeks, I'd carefully tested the waters with Eliza. When I'd shown her the patents and trademarks officially registered to the company, I'd casually mentioned inconsistencies in the records. "It's strange," I'd commented, watching her reaction closely. "Some of these filings have different signatures than our historical documents indicate they should." Eliza had frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "That's odd. Could it be a clerical error?" "Perhaps," I'd replied. "Or perhaps the company history isn't exactly what we've been told." To my surprise, instead of dismissing my observations or running to Richard, Eliza had shown genuine curiosity. "What do you mean?" I'd pulled back then, not ready to reveal my full hand. "Just that corporations this old often have complicated histories. Stories get simplified over time." The conversation had sparked something unexpected between us. Not friendship exactly, but a tentative mutual respect. Still, I harbored no illusions. Eliza was here to take my job, whether she liked me or not. Today was the day everything would change. My attorney had confirmed all the documents' authenticity and registered the transferred patents and trademarks in my name with the appropriate government offices. The paper trail was clear and legally binding. I'd learned through Carter's assistant that a special board meeting had been scheduled, ostensibly to discuss quarterly results, but the real agenda was to vote on Eliza's appointment to Vice President of Operations. My position. They hadn't bothered to invite me. I adjusted my charcoal suit, the power suit I saved for major negotiations, and checked my appearance one last time in the bathroom mirror. My dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, not a strand out of place. No hint of the storm I was about to unleash. At exactly 10:28 a.m., 2 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to begin, I walked calmly to the executive conference room, leather portfolio in hand. Through the glass walls, I could see them already assembled. Richard at the head of the table, Carter to his right, Eliza beside Carter, the 5 other board members in their usual seats. I pushed open the door, and all conversation ceased. "Olivia," Richard recovered first, surprise quickly masked by annoyance. "We're about to start a private board meeting." "I'm aware," I replied, taking the empty seat at the far end of the table. "That's why I'm here." Carter leaned forward. "This is a closed meeting, Olivia. For board members only." I smiled pleasantly. "I understand. I just thought you might want all relevant parties present for today's discussion." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Please," I gestured toward him. "Continue with your agenda. I'm happy to wait for the appropriate moment." Confusion rippled through the room, but Richard pressed on, clearly determined to maintain control. He began with the usual preamble about company performance, then transitioned to the real purpose of the meeting. "As you all know, succession planning is vital to any family business," he said, the irony of his words nearly making me laugh out loud. "Today, I'm proposing we create a new executive position, Vice President of Global Operations, to be filled by Eliza Wellington." Murmurs of approval circulated the table. Carter beamed at his fiancée. "Eliza comes to us with exceptional credentials," Richard continued, "and has spent the past month learning our operations from the ground up under Olivia's guidance." All eyes turned briefly to me. I maintained my composed expression, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "With this appointment, we ensure that Hensley Textiles leadership remains firmly in the family as we move forward," Richard concluded. "Olivia will be transitioning to a consulting role, allowing her more flexibility as she and James consider starting a family." The lie slid so smoothly from his lips that several board members nodded sympathetically in my direction, as if this were all being done for my benefit. "Before we vote," Richard added, almost as an afterthought, "does anyone have any questions or comments?" The moment had arrived. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, "I do have something to add." Richard's jaw tightened, but he gestured for me to proceed, clearly expecting some tearful protest or resigned acceptance. Instead, I opened my portfolio and removed a thick binder of documents, placing it precisely in the center of the table. "These are the original ownership rights of Hensley Textiles," I stated, my voice ringing clearly in the sudden silence. "Patent filings, trademark registrations, and proprietary production formulas, all legally belonging to William Langford, my grandfather, and now to me as his heir." The room froze. Richard stared at the binder as if it might bite him. "What nonsense is this?" Carter finally sputtered. "Not nonsense," I replied, sliding copies of the most crucial documents down the table. "Legal fact. William Langford and Harold Hensley founded this company together in 1946. When my grandfather stepped away from daily operations in 1965, he retained ownership of all intellectual property that makes Hensley Textiles profitable." Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is absurd. My father built this company from nothing. These documents are obviously forgeries." "They're not," I countered calmly. "They've been authenticated by 2 separate law firms and properly filed with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Your company has been using intellectual property it doesn't own for decades." One of the board members, a lawyer by training, had picked up the partnership agreement and was examining it with growing concern. "Richard, these look legitimate." "It's a trick," Richard hissed, but doubt had entered his eyes. "It has to be." I turned to address the full board. "For years, I've poured my heart and soul into this company, only to be reminded constantly that I wasn't real family, just someone who married in. Now we discover that my bloodline runs deeper in this company than the Hensley name itself." Eliza was staring at me, shock mingled with something that looked almost like admiration. Carter had gone pale, slumping back in his chair as the implications sank in. "You can verify everything in that binder," I concluded. "But I'll save you some time. Hensley Textiles cannot legally use its brand, its signature fabrics, or its most profitable manufacturing processes without my explicit permission. Permission that, as of this moment, I am formally withdrawing." The resulting silence was so profound I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. 7 pairs of eyes stared at me in disbelief. And Richard Hensley, for perhaps the first time in his life, had absolutely nothing to say. The 24 hours following my boardroom revelation were a hurricane of legal meetings, stunned phone calls, and the unmistakable shifting of power. I'd arranged for my attorney to be waiting in the lobby, a precaution that proved wise when Richard finally found his voice. "This is corporate espionage," he'd sputtered, face flushed with rage. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys." I'd simply smiled. "I believe your attorneys will be quite busy reviewing those documents, but please call them in." By afternoon, Hensley Textiles' legal team had confirmed what I already knew. The documents were ironclad. My grandfather had legally maintained ownership of the intellectual property, and as his heir, those rights were now legitimately mine. The company had been operating with borrowed power for decades, never suspecting the foundation beneath them could be pulled away at any moment. Now, I sat in the same boardroom, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Gone was Richard's domineering presence at the head of the table. Instead, he slumped in a chair halfway down, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His kingdom was crumbling, and he knew it. The board members filed in with solemn faces. This emergency session had been called by the chairman himself after Hensley's attorneys confirmed my claims. Carter was conspicuously absent. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," the chairman began, his voice grave. "As you've been informed, we face an unprecedented situation. Ms. Langford has legal ownership of intellectual property essential to Hensley Textiles operations." All eyes turned to me, no longer with dismissal, but with wary respect. Our attorneys advise that without a new agreement, we cannot legally continue manufacturing our core product lines or even use the Hensley Textiles name in commerce. Richard made a choked sound but said nothing. Ms. Langford has requested this meeting to present a proposal, the chairman continued, nodding in my direction. The floor is yours. I stood, smoothing my skirt with steady hands. The nervousness I'd felt yesterday had evaporated, replaced by a calm certainty. This was my moment, not for revenge, but for restoration. Thank you, I began. I want to start by saying that despite recent revelations, my commitment to this company has never wavered. I've invested 7 years of my life here because I believe in what we make and the people who make it. I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's display system. A new company structure appeared on screen. I'm proposing a reorganization and rebranding. Hensley Textiles becomes the Langford Hensley Group, acknowledging the true legacy of both founding families. Richard flinched at this, but I continued. The new structure emphasizes 3 core pillars that will secure our future. First, sustainable manufacturing practices using updated versions of my grandfather's formulas. Second, transparent supply chain management across all operations. And third, a profit-sharing program for long-term employees. I clicked to the next slide, showing projected growth curves. Initial investment will be substantial, but projections show a 32% increase in profitability within 18 months. More importantly, this approach aligns with market trends towards sustainability and ethical manufacturing. For the next 20 minutes, I detailed my vision: modernizing production facilities, phasing out toxic chemicals from the manufacturing process, implementing worker safety protocols that exceeded industry standards. All innovations I'd pushed for years, only to be blocked by Richard's resistance to change. When I finished, the room was silent, but it was a different quality of silence than yesterday's shock. This was consideration. Evaluation. The CFO spoke first. These projections look aggressive, but achievable. The sustainability angle opens markets we've struggled to penetrate. The marketing director nodded. The Langford Hensley rebranding gives us a compelling narrative. 2 founding families reunited through a new generation of leadership. Only Richard remained unmoved, staring at the table with clenched jaw. Before we proceed further, I said, addressing him directly for the first time, I want to make one thing clear, Richard. I'm not here to destroy what your family built. I'm here to honor both our legacies and move this company forward. His eyes finally met mine, decades of pride warring with the reality of his situation. And my position in this new organization? Senior advisor to the board, I replied. Your experience is valuable, Richard, but operational control needs to shift. The chairman cleared his throat. I believe we need to put this to a vote. The proposal would install Ms. Langford as CEO, with a reorganized executive team reporting directly to her. The vote was quick and decisive. 6 in favor, 1 abstention, Richard. As the room cleared, Eliza approached me, her expression unreadable. That was impressive. Thank you, I replied cautiously. For what it's worth, I never knew about any of this, she said. Richard just told me there was an executive position opening up that would be perfect for me. I studied her face, seeing sincerity there. What will you do now? She shrugged, a hint of a smile touching her lips. I've had an offer from Wellington Industries. My family's business. I was only joining Hensley because Carter insisted it would strengthen our connection. And Carter? I asked. Currently not answering my calls, she said with surprising lightness. Apparently dating the woman who helped dethrone his father wasn't part of his 5-year plan. I found myself laughing despite everything. Men can be so particular about their dynasties. As Eliza turned to leave, she paused. For what it's worth, I think your grandfather would be proud. Alone in the boardroom, I sat at the head of the table, a position I'd never expected to occupy. Through the glass walls, I could see employees gathered in small clusters, whispers and speculation flying. News traveled fast in corporate corridors. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Just heard. CEO? We need to celebrate. Dinner at Giovanni's tonight. I smiled, typing back. It's official. And yes to dinner. I have quite a story to tell you. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. 500 employees now looked to me for leadership. But alongside it came a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into their proper places after decades of misalignment. The Langford legacy had awakened. And for the first time since finding my grandfather's lockbox, I felt his presence beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his voice in my ear. Well done, Olivia. Well done. 6 months passed with the speed of a hurricane. Each day brought new challenges as I transformed the company from the inside out. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, like finally steering a ship that had been drifting off course for decades. Today marked the culmination of those efforts. I stood in the lobby of our headquarters, watching as workers carefully installed the new corporate sign, Langford Hensley Group, in sleek, modern letters. The hyphen between the names felt significant, a bridge connecting past to present, one legacy to another. Quite the statement. Came a voice behind me. I turned to find James, hands in his pockets, admiring the sign. In the chaos of the transition, we'd found a new equilibrium in our marriage. The initial shock of learning his family history wasn't what he believed had given way to a quiet pride in what we were building together. Too much? I asked, suddenly uncertain. He shook his head. No. It's exactly right. We watched in silence as the installation crew made final adjustments. Employees passed through the lobby, some pausing to take in the change, others hardly noticing, the new normal already accepted. Have you spoken to your father? I asked. James sighed. Briefly. He's still processing. Richard had taken his demotion exactly as expected. Badly. He'd spent the first month challenging every decision I made in board meetings, pointing out potential failures before initiatives even launched. When that didn't work, he'd switched to cold silence, attending meetings but offering nothing. Finally, last month, he'd begun showing up only when absolutely required, spending most of his time at his country club. And Carter? Still in Europe with that Swiss investment banker he met, James said with a wry smile. Apparently, losing his guaranteed CEO position was too much for his delicate constitution. I couldn't help but smile. Carter had disappeared within days of the ownership revelation, embarking on what his social media dubbed a life reassessment journey through Mediterranean yacht parties and alpine ski resorts. Ms. Langford, my new assistant, approached. The documentary crew is ready for you in the conference room. For our rebranding launch, we'd commissioned a short film about the company's true history, the partnership between William Langford and Harold Hensley, the innovations they'd created together, and the strange twist of fate that had brought their grandchildren full circle. I'll be right there, I assured her. As she walked away, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I pulled it out, scanning the message quickly. Good news? James asked, noting my expression. The best, I replied, showing him the screen. The Indonesian factory renovation is complete. Solar panels installed, new ventilation system operational, wastewater treatment facility running at 95% efficiency. It had been my first major initiative as CEO, transforming our oldest and least efficient factory into a model of sustainable manufacturing. The budget had nearly doubled during implementation, causing several tense board meetings, but the results would speak for themselves. You're changing more than just a name, James said, squeezing my hand. I hope so, I replied. We walked together toward the elevator, passing the company timeline display I'd had updated. Where once it had shown only Harold Hensley's stern portrait under founder, it now featured a black and white photograph of two young men, William Langford and Harold Hensley, arms around each other's shoulders, standing proudly before their first factory. In my office, the corner suite that had once been Richard's, I paused before entering the conference room. Through the glass, I could see the documentary crew setting up their equipment, the marketing team reviewing talking points, and several board members chatting amiably. Nervous? James asked. No, I realized, somewhat surprised. For the first time in 7 years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The documentary interview lasted 2 hours. I shared stories my grandmother had told me about William, explained his textile innovations in layman's terms, and outlined my vision for honoring both families' legacies while pushing the company forward. One final question, the director said as we wrapped up. After everything that happened, do you feel vindicated? I considered this carefully. Vindication suggests I was seeking revenge, which wasn't my goal. What I wanted, what I've always wanted, was recognition. Not just for myself, but for my grandfather's contributions to this company. And beyond that, I wanted to create something better than what existed before. Later that afternoon, I stood alone in my office, looking out over the city as the sun began to set. On my desk sat a small wooden box, a gift from my grandmother Eleanor that I'd found among her possessions. Inside was a handwritten note from my grandfather. Remember that legacy isn't what others say about you. It's what you build that outlasts you. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called. To my surprise, Richard entered. In 6 months, he'd aged years, his hair now more gray than black, lines etched deeper around his mouth and eyes. But today, something was different. The perpetual anger had faded from his expression, replaced by something almost like resignation. "I saw the new sign," he said without preamble. I braced myself for criticism. "And it's fitting," he admitted, each word seemingly difficult to extract. "Both names should be there." Coming from Richard, this was tantamount to a full surrender. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded once, looked as if he might say more, then thought better of it and turned to leave. "Richard," I called after him, "the company anniversary dinner next month. I'd like you to speak, tell some stories about the early days with your father, if you're willing." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps a touch of gratitude. "I'll consider it." After he left, I returned to the window, watching as the company's illuminated sign glowed to life against the darkening sky. Langford Hensley. 2 families. 2 legacies. 1 future. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from being the outsider, the one who had married in, to becoming the guardian of both families' legacies. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dinner at home tonight? I'm cooking." "On my way," I replied, gathering my things. As I walked out, I paused once more before the new sign, allowing myself a moment of quiet triumph. Not because I'd won some corporate Game of Thrones, but because after generations of hidden truths and buried history, things were finally as they should be. I wasn't just a wife or a daughter-in-law or an outsider who had married in. I was Olivia Langford, heir to a legacy that had been waiting for me all along. And my name was exactly where it belonged, on the door,